They stood barefoot on the tarmac, uniforms stripped, eyes downcast, the humid Pacific wind carrying the last fragments of an empire into the sea. These were not soldiers now, nor prisoners, nor even enemies. They were women, once officers of a nation that had burned its soul to ash. And as the American women approached with boxes of spare clothes, the captured Japanese officers began to cry, not from pain, not from humiliation, but from something far deeper, a collapse of meaning, the realization that mercy had survived where their cause had not. War, for all its machinery and banners, always ends here, in silence, in the trembling of hands that have forgotten what they're supposed to hold. If you're drawn to the forgotten corners of history, to the moments where humanity flickers through the wreckage, then subscribe, share, and join us as we unravel this story. Because this is not just a tale of surrender, but of transformation, of how compassion can haunt harder than hatred. The sky above Tokyo in August 1945 looked less like a sky, and more like an old scar, red at the edges, gray in the middle, and raw from too many wounds. The empire that once called itself divine had collapsed into silence. Factories stood gutted, their chimneys coughing smoke like the dying breath of a fevered god. Trains moved again, but they carried no soldiers now, only refugees, burnt-out workers, and widows who no longer wore white. Japan's surrender was not announced with fanfare. It came as a whisper carried through ruins, as radio broadcasts trembling with disbelief, as the thud of boots that no longer marched in rhythm. In the heart of that silence stood women who had served in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, many of them officers. Some had been trained in medical units, others in logistics, clerical work, or military intelligence. They were the forgotten spine of a war that had promised eternal victory, then turned them into witnesses of its ruin. When word reached them that the emperor himself had spoken, that Japan would endure the unendurable, the words did not sound like surrender. They sounded like erasure. Every oath, every ritual, every salute had been built on the belief that he could never fall. And now, in a single broadcast, the sun had set on eternity. The day the surrender was announced, Lieutenant Midori Sato stood outside a hospital in Yokohama, her hands still stained with iodine and ash. Around her, the wounded muttered prayers that no longer had gods to hear them. In the distance, the ocean was calm, insultingly calm, as if the war had never touched it. She watched a formation of American B-29s drift across the horizon and wondered how many of those same aircraft had turned her city into a furnace. She could still smell the burnt tatami mats, the melted stone, the human scent that clung to the ruins like a curse. When the Allied forces began to land, it was not with the thunder of invasion, but with the weary caution of men who had already seen too much. They came ashore in perfect formation, rifles ready but eyes wary, expecting resistance that never came. The Japanese soldiers who remained were thin, hollow-eyed, and silent. The women among them, nurses, clerks, auxiliary officers, stood apart, their faces hidden behind the remains of discipline. They still wore the khaki or gray-green uniforms of the Imperial Army, though the insignia had been cut away. Some carried notebooks instead of weapons. Others still wore armbands marked with faded kanji that once signified service, honor, or victory. But victory had changed its meaning. For the American occupation troops, the sight was surreal. They had been told that Japan's warriors would fight to the last breath, that even the women would resist, that capture was unthinkable. Yet here they stood. The same women who had once sworn to die before dishonor, waiting in silence for their orders from men they'd been taught to hate. They did not raise their voices, nor did they kneel. They simply stood still, caught between obedience and disbelief, their loyalty now weightless as ash. The surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri was a spectacle for the cameras. The surrender on land was something else entirely. Intimate, raw, and almost unbearable in its quietness. The Japanese women officers, stripped of command and dignity, were rounded up for processing in coastal camps under Allied supervision. They were not mistreated. In truth, the Americans seemed uncertain what to do with them. The war had been fought on principles of total annihilation. Yet what they faced now were not warriors, but ghosts of an ideology that had imploded under its own certainty. The first camp was set up outside Yokosuka, near a stretch of shoreline that still smelled of oil and burnt metal. The women arrived in small groups, escorted by soldiers who kept a careful distance. There were no barbed wire fences yet, only the moral barrier between conqueror and conquered. The prisoners were searched, their papers confiscated, their possessions catalogued. Among the items taken, hairpins carved from aircraft aluminum, family photographs wrapped in cloth, and folded orders bearing the emperor's seal, now meaningless but still treated with reverence. One of the interpreters, a young Nisei from California, later wrote that what struck him most was not defiance, but composure. "They did not cry," he noted in his diary. "They only looked at us as though we had entered a temple and spoken too loudly." For the women, surrender was not simply the end of war. It was the collapse of identity. They had been told that the uniform they wore connected them to something eternal, that through service they became part of the emperor's living body. Now, under the white glare of Allied lamps, they were told that their uniforms marked them as criminals. The same cloth that had been blessed by officers and worn with pride was now a symbol of guilt. They were ordered to remove insignia, to cut off cords, to unpin medals. For some, the act felt like peeling skin. When night fell, the camp was illuminated by dim lanterns swaying in the wind. A typhoon's remnants still lingered in the air, bringing with it the scent of salt and rain. The women huddled together in canvas tents, whispering the names of lost cities, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Okinawa, each word carrying the weight of unspeakable loss. Some spoke of the emperor's voice on the radio, how thin and distant it had sounded, like a god receding into the clouds. Others confessed they had not understood his words at all. They had only heard the silence afterward. Beyond the tents, Allied guards paced with quiet unease. They had fought through hell to reach this moment, yet victory did not feel like triumph. It felt heavy, hollow, almost mournful. For every uniform taken, for every sword surrendered, there remained the question no one dared to ask aloud. What happens to a nation when belief itself has surrendered? In the camp records, the captured female officers were labeled non-combatant auxiliaries. But in truth, they were something else. The last living remnants of an empire that had worshipped death as duty. They did not yet know it, but soon they would face an order that none of their training could prepare them for. An order that would strip them not just of rank, but of the very identity that had sustained them through the war. The sun had set on the empire. What came next would not be darkness, but something quieter. The slow, painful dawn of reckoning. The first morning in the camp was heavy with rain. The Pacific air clung to everything. The canvas, the mud, the faces of the women who no longer knew whether to call themselves soldiers or prisoners. The horizon was a dull strip of gray-blue where sea met sky, and beyond it lay the invisible presence of an army that had won everything except the ability to forget. The Allied guards moved like men half adrift in their own disbelief, speaking softly among themselves as if loud voices might shatter whatever fragile calm held this place together. Lieutenant Midori Sato sat near the camp fence, her hair cropped short and uneven, her boots caked with clay. She had not spoken since arriving. The uniform she still wore, once pressed, spotless, precise, now hung off her like a borrowed memory. Around her, the others whispered in half-phrases, voices rough from exhaustion and hunger. They spoke not of defeat, but of survival, of the rice they would not taste again, of the barracks burned to the ground, of brothers who had vanished into the jungle and were now names scratched into the corners of notebooks. Across the yard, American sentries smoked in silence. Their faces were drawn, their uniforms immaculate, but their eyes betrayed the same weariness that haunted the captives. Some had fought in Iwo Jima or Guam. Some had seen the black smoke of Okinawa. The war had trained them to see the enemy as a faceless thing, relentless, merciless, fanatical. But now, looking at these women in tattered gray, they saw something that broke that illusion. Not monsters, not warriors, just human beings, pale, hollow-eyed, frightened, and unsure what they had ever been fighting for. When rations came, it was chaos without noise. The women lined up in perfect formation out of habit, as if waiting for an officer to give orders. The American corporal in charge hesitated, holding the ladle awkwardly, watching as each woman bowed slightly before receiving her tin of watery soup. It felt wrong, obscene even, to feed an army that had slaughtered so many of his own. But the war was over now, and orders were orders. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the act of feeding was more intimate than any victory. Inside the tents, time stopped meaning anything. Rain dripped through seams in the fabric, pooling near the women's boots. They spoke little during the day and not at all at night. Some wrote letters that would never be sent. Others stared at the ground for hours, as if waiting for it to open and swallow them whole. One woman tore the buttons from her coat and buried them in the mud, whispering the names of her fallen comrades as she pressed each one beneath the earth. Another sat by the fire pit, polishing her badge of service until the metal flaked away under her fingers. A few tried to cling to discipline. Each dawn, before the Americans stirred, they gathered silently at the far edge of the camp to bow toward the rising sun. The ritual was small, almost invisible, a gesture not of faith but of memory. Yet even that was fading. The sun rose behind clouds now, pale and weak, offering no warmth, no promise. By the second week, the interrogations began. An Allied officer, flanked by interpreters, questioned the women in a small hut that smelled of damp paper and kerosene. The questions were the same: names, ranks, duties, knowledge of war crimes. But the women had little to offer. Most had served as clerks or nurses, shuffling papers, tending wounds, or carrying messages through bombardment. Yet, beneath their answers, something deeper lingered. A shared shame that could not be translated. Midori's turn came on the fourth day. She stood before the desk with her hands clasped, refusing the chair offered to her. The officer, a man not much older than she, asked if she understood why she was here. She nodded but said nothing. When pressed, she finally spoke, her voice thin but steady. "Because I obeyed." The interpreter paused, unsure how to respond. The words hung between them, not as confession, but as truth. Outside, the rain began again. It washed through the camp trenches, carrying bits of straw and ash toward the sea. The tide swallowed everything without judgment. The Americans noticed how the women never cried, not when questioned, not when insulted, not when the rations ran thin, or when another one fainted from exhaustion. Their silence felt unnatural, almost inhuman. But what they did not know, what even the women themselves could barely understand, was that tears had been forbidden long before surrender. For years, they had been taught that emotion was weakness, that loyalty was a shield against grief. And now, with the shield gone, they didn't know how to feel at all. In the evenings, when the guards lit fires to keep away the mosquitoes, shadows danced along the fence line. Some of the younger soldiers whispered among themselves about the women, their faces, their quietness, the strange calm that seemed to linger around them. They could not comprehend that the calm was not peace, but emptiness. One night, As thunder rolled over the coast, Midori watched a flicker of lightning cut across the sea. For a moment, the world was illuminated. The guards, the tents, the faces of her comrades, all frozen in pale light. And she wondered, not for the first time, whether the war had truly ended. The uniforms said yes. The silence said otherwise. In the following days, rumors spread. Some said they would be shipped to a larger camp inland. Others believed they would be executed quietly, away from the press and the cameras. A few whispered of American nurses, women like themselves, who had come to Japan to tend to the wounded and who had asked to visit the prisoners. Most dismissed it as fantasy. The Americans were not here for kindness. And yet, by the end of that week, trucks appeared at the camp gates. Inside were crates marked not with weapons, but with words the prisoners could not read. Medical Relief, Pacific Service Corps. The women stared as the soldiers unloaded them. The crates were opened. Inside lay folded dresses, soap, combs, blankets, and shoes. For the first time since surrender, a sound rippled through the camp. Soft, confused, almost terrified. Not of punishment, but of something far harder to bear. Compassion. The shore that had once been the edge of empire had become a place of quiet reckoning. And soon, that reckoning would burn hotter than any bomb. The trucks rolled to a halt in the mud, engines coughing and settling into silence. The American soldiers stepped down first, followed by a handful of women in crisp khaki uniforms with Red Cross armbands stitched neatly against their sleeves. Their boots sank slightly into the wet earth as they moved toward the camp, carrying wooden crates stamped with English words that the Japanese prisoners couldn't read but instinctively feared. The camp guards opened the gates without a word. A line of Japanese women, officers once, prisoners now, watched in motionless uncertainty, their breath shallow, their hands folded as if awaiting judgment. The American nurses had come from nearby naval bases, assigned to humanitarian detail, a duty they neither asked for nor fully understood. Many had spent months tending to the charred, skeletal survivors of Pacific combat. They had seen what Japanese fire and steel had done to men they called brothers. Yet here they were, standing before the women who had worn the same uniforms as those responsible. Duty demanded compassion. Memory resisted it. The crates were opened. Out came the smell of starch, soap, and fabric. Scents alien in this place of smoke and mildew. Inside were cotton dresses, combs, and bars of soap wrapped in paper. The prisoners stared at them as though they were relics from another world. One of the American women, a lieutenant named Margaret Hayes, hesitated before stepping forward. She held a folded dress in both hands, plain, white, soft. She approached the nearest prisoner, an officer barely older than herself, whose gray-green uniform was torn and caked in dirt. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two uniforms, two nations, two women divided by everything history had demanded. Then, with trembling hands, Margaret offered the dress. The Japanese woman did not move. Her lips parted, but no words came. The translator, a Japanese-American corporal, murmured gently in her ear, explaining what this was. The woman's expression changed, slowly, as though understanding itself was painful. She took the dress, her fingers brushing against Margaret's, and then she began to cry. Not the quiet tears of exhaustion that came at night when no one was watching, but sudden, breaking sobs that tore from her chest without control. Her knees gave out, the white dress pressed against her face, her voice a flood of something the Americans could not translate. Around her, the others stared in shock. Some turned away. Some began to tremble. And then, like rain spreading through dry grass, it happened again. Another woman began to cry. Then another. The air filled with sound, raw, human, unstoppable. The American nurses froze. None of them had expected this. They had imagined hostility, resistance, or at least silence. But this release, was unbearable in its honesty. One of the nurses, tears welling in her own eyes, knelt instinctively and reached out to steady the sobbing prisoner. There was no language for this gesture. There didn't need to be. The camp seemed to stop breathing. Even the guards, usually stone-faced, looked away. For years, they had been taught that the enemy was something other. That these people, these soldiers, had chosen fanaticism over life. But now they watched their enemies collapse under the weight of mercy. The Japanese officers, stripped of rank and certainty, wept for everything, for the war, for their brothers lost in fire, for the emperor's voice that had once promised divinity and now sounded hollow. They wept for the moment they realized that kindness had survived when the empire had not, that the enemy they were told was monstrous could still offer them dignity. Margaret Hayes did not move for a long time. When she finally stood, her hands were shaking. The dress she'd offered was soaked through with tears. She looked at the interpreter and whispered, "Why are they crying?" He paused before answering. "Because they don't know what to do with kindness." By evening, the camp was transformed. The women who had clung to their filthy uniforms now held plain cotton dresses, folded neatly in their laps. Some washed their faces for the first time in weeks. The air smelled faintly of soap, a scent that mingled strangely with the salt and mud. It was the smell of something new being born, though no one dared name it. As night fell, Margaret and her team packed their empty crates. They had come expecting resentment. Instead, they left in silence, each woman carrying something unspoken. The weight of empathy that felt heavier than any weapon. On the drive back, no one spoke. The headlights carved a path through fog and darkness, and in the rearview mirror, the camp faded into shadow. The faint outlines of women standing in the rain, clutching their new clothes like sacred offerings. Inside the tents, Midori sat cross-legged, the white fabric resting across her knees. She ran her fingers over the seams, tracing them as if trying to understand what it meant to hold something clean, something untainted by war. The softness felt wrong at first, foreign. But as she pressed it to her chest, she felt the first warmth she'd known in months. Later that night, as she lay awake, listening to the soft murmurs of her comrades, Midori whispered a single word, "Yasashi," gentle. It was a word they had not used in years. Outside, the guards smoked their last cigarettes under a dim lamp. One of them, an older sergeant, muttered quietly, "Hell of a thing to see." Another nodded, staring toward the tents. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "Maybe this is what winning's supposed to look like." The rain had stopped. The moonlight fell across the camp, pale and uncertain, illuminating faces that had once been enemies but were now simply human, fragile, exhausted, and beginning, just barely, to heal. For the Japanese women, the exchange had shattered something sacred. For the Americans, it had mended something broken. Neither side would ever be the same again. The next morning, the sound of the ocean carried across the camp. Rhythmic, endless, indifferent. Yet in that sound, there was something different now. Not victory, not defeat. Recognition. In the days that followed, the camp fell into an uneasy quiet. The cries that had once echoed through the night were replaced by a different kind of silence. Not the heavy stillness of despair, but the fragile calm that comes after a storm has passed. It was a silence that held reflection, confusion, and something dangerously close to hope. The American nurses had left, but their presence lingered in every corner of the camp. The smell of soap and starch still clung to the air. The cotton dresses hung carefully near cots or folded beneath sleeping heads. They had become symbols of something the women did not yet understand. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but the first breath of a world that no longer demanded hate. Midori Sato found herself sitting by the water whenever she could. The camp's boundary ended at a low fence near the shoreline, and from there she could watch the tide roll in and out, the waves hissing softly as if whispering secrets. Before the war, she had grown up near Kyoto, where the rivers ran clear and slow, where fishermen hummed songs while casting their nets. But that memory had been buried long ago beneath the machinery of empire, replaced by marching orders, drills, and the rhythmic chants of loyalty to a divine cause. Now, as she watched the sea glisten in the pale morning light, she realized how deeply she had forgotten the sound of gentleness. Across the camp, the other women moved differently now. Some still wore fragments of their uniforms, unwilling or unable to part with them completely. Others had embraced the cotton dresses, washing them carefully at the edge of the camp as though the garments were alive. To wear white again, unmarked, unstained, felt almost blasphemous. The color had once been reserved for purity, for weddings, for death. Now it was something else. Survival. One morning, an American chaplain entered the camp. He was young and awkward, his uniform immaculate, his posture betraying the unease of a man who did not know how to preach to the defeated. He spoke through an interpreter, his words halting, uncertain. "You fought for your homeland," he said, "and now your homeland needs you to live for it." The women listened in silence, their faces expressionless. But later that night, as the fires dimmed and the guards' footsteps faded, one of the prisoners murmured softly, "To live after all this?" The words hung in the air like incense smoke, faint, questioning, almost sacred. Midori began keeping a journal, writing in the margins of an old field manual she had hidden through the surrender. Her entries were sparse, her handwriting delicate. "They brought us dresses," she wrote one night. "The fabric is soft. It feels like something I do not deserve. I do not know what it means to be forgiven, but perhaps this is what it looks like when someone tries." Days bled into weeks. The Americans brought new supplies: rice, medicine, blankets. A few of the women volunteered to help distribute them, their movements still bound by the reflexes of military discipline. When an officer handed Midori a tin of rice, she bowed instinctively, murmuring "arigato." The officer, surprised, nodded back. It was a small exchange, a gesture so ordinary that it might have gone unnoticed anywhere else. But here, in the ruins of war, it carried the quiet weight of transformation. As word spread of Japan's reconstruction, the women began hearing fragments of news from the outside. Tokyo was rebuilding. The emperor had renounced his divinity. Trials had begun for war criminals. Some of the women whispered names: generals, admirals, ministers, men they had once sworn to obey. Now those same men were being judged by the victors, their power reduced to testimony and translation. The women did not rejoice at this. They did not condemn either. They simply watched from afar, caught between guilt and relief. One evening, a storm approached from the east. The sea turned black beneath the rising wind. The guards shouted for the women to take cover, but many remained outside, staring toward the horizon. The rain fell hard, drenching the camp, flattening the fires, washing away footprints. And yet, amid the storm, something remarkable happened. A few of the women began to laugh, softly at first, then freely, as though laughter itself were an act of rebellion against the war's ghost. Midori stood among them, her hair plastered to her forehead, her white dress clinging to her skin. For the first time, she did not think of surrender as humiliation. She thought of it as breathing again. The empire that had once ruled her life was gone, but beneath its ashes, something human remained, something small and stubborn and alive. When the rain finally stopped, the camp glistened under a low sun. Steam rose from the earth like the breath of something reborn. The guards opened the gates to drain the water, and for a moment, the world outside looked less like an enemy's land and more like a place waiting to be remade. In her final journal entry of that week, Midori wrote, Perhaps surrender is not the end of loyalty. Perhaps it is the beginning of truth. The next morning, a notice arrived. Preparations were being made to release some of the women. They would be allowed to return home. But what did home mean now to those who had built their entire selves around a war that no longer existed? That question lingered like smoke over the camp, and in the days that followed, its answer would come not through words, but through what they chose to carry, and what they chose to leave behind. The order came quietly, written on thin gray paper and delivered by an American officer whose voice was softer than his uniform allowed. The war was long over, he said. Japan was rebuilding. Those who had no record of violence, no direct hand in atrocities, would soon be repatriated. The women would be returned to what remained of their homes. At first, the camp did not react. The announcement hung in the air, foreign and impossible. Home. That word had not meant anything in months. For some, home was a smoking ruin. For others, a memory blurred by propaganda and death. And for many, there was nothing left at all. But the idea that they might once again step beyond the wire, breathe air that did not belong to the victors, that they might walk as civilians rather than prisoners, it was enough to make their hearts tremble. When the trucks finally arrived, the women gathered what little they had. A few carried the dresses the Americans had given them, folded with care, wrapped in makeshift bundles. Others kept fragments of their uniforms, the insignia, the buttons, the faded ribbons, reminders not of pride, but of identity. They had entered the war believing they served something divine. Now, they left it serving something fragile, survival. The Americans lined the path to the trucks. They did not speak. They simply watched as the women walked past, their heads bowed, their steps light in the morning mud. Some of the guards saluted out of habit. Others lowered their eyes, uncertain whether to feel sorrow or relief. The chaplain stood near the gate, his hat clutched in his hands, whispering prayers in a language no one there understood. As the trucks rumbled toward the port, Midori Sato sat near the back, the white cotton dress folded neatly in her lap. The wind from the open truck bed caught her hair, blowing it across her face. She watched the jungle recede, the wire fences vanish behind them, and for the first time since the surrender, she felt the earth widening again. The air smelled of salt and diesel and rain. She could almost taste freedom, bitter and beautiful. The port was chaos and silence all at once. Hundreds of returning prisoners, men and women alike, lined the docks beneath the rusted cranes, waiting to board the ships that would take them home. Some wept openly, others stared at the ground. Japanese officers in patched uniforms stood beside Allied escorts, their swords confiscated, their medals gone. Yet, even stripped of power, they carried themselves with a strange grace. The posture of those who had lost everything but refused to bow to despair. When Midori stepped onto the deck of the repatriation vessel, she felt the boards sway beneath her feet. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, gray, calm, endless. It was not the sea of conquest she had imagined in her youth. It was the sea of consequence. As the ship pulled away from the shore, a group of women gathered along the railing. They watched the land fade, their faces unreadable. The youngest of them, barely 20, asked in a trembling voice, "What do we do now?" No one answered. That night, under the dim yellow glow of a single deck lamp, the women sat together in silence. One by one, they took out the remnants of their past. Small trinkets, photographs, scraps of paper. Midori unfolded a letter she had written to her brother in 1944, but never sent. The ink had faded, but she could still read her own handwriting. "The Emperor's light guides us," it said. "Victory will bring honor to all who serve." She tore the paper in half. Then in quarters, then in silence, she let the wind carry the pieces away. For the first time in years, she felt light. Days later, The coastline of Japan appeared through the mist. Jagged mountains, fields of rice half flooded by rain, the faint outline of villages scarred by war. Smoke still rose from distant hills. But there were people, too. Children playing by the docks, farmers mending nets, women hanging laundry on broken fences. Life, stubborn and unyielding, had returned. When the prisoners disembarked, local officials stood waiting with lists and transport trucks. Each name was read aloud, each woman directed toward a destination. A town, a city, a family that might or might not still exist. When Midori's name was called, she stepped forward, bowing slightly. The official glanced up, surprised by her composure. "Kyoto," he said, handing her a slip of paper. "There is nothing left of your old home, but you may find someone who remembers you." The road to Kyoto was long and quiet. Villages passed like ghosts. The countryside was dotted with half-collapsed shrines, their paper lanterns blackened by soot. At one stop, Midori shared her food with a child whose mother had not returned from the war. The boy stared at her white dress, then smiled faintly. The first smile she had seen in months. It was enough. When she reached Kyoto, the train station was a skeleton of iron beams and shattered glass. The city she remembered, of shrines and blossoms and morning bells, was gone, replaced by ruins and scaffolding. Yet amid the rubble, life moved with quiet determination. Women swept the streets. Men carried bricks. Monks offered rice to the hungry. The world was broken, but it was rebuilding itself piece by fragile piece. Midori found what was left of her family home. The gate was gone. The walls had collapsed. Only a single stone lantern remained standing in the courtyard, its top cracked, its base covered in moss. She knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the worn edges. It was here, in the ruins, that she unfolded the white dress once more. She pressed it to her face, breathing in the faint scent of salt and soap that still lingered from the camp. It was more than cloth now. It was a memory of mercy, the kind that made survival possible. She hung the dress on the broken frame of what had once been a window. The wind caught it gently, and for a moment it fluttered like a flag, not of surrender, but of release. As dusk fell, she sat on the steps of her ruined home, watching the light fade over the city. The mountains turned to shadows, and the air filled with the sound of cicadas. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang, deep, low, eternal. Midori closed her eyes. The war was over. The empire was gone. But the world, fragile, wounded, human, had begun again, and she, too, would begin again. For the first time, she allowed herself to whisper a prayer, not to emperors or gods, but to the simple miracle of being alive. May we never forget what mercy looks like. The wind carried the words away, weaving them through the ruins, across the hills, and into the night. A quiet benediction for all who had endured, all who had lost, and all who still believed that even in the ashes of war, humanity could bloom again.